My name is Joaquin Mendoza, and I'm a master brewer from Portland, Oregon. When Yellowstone erupted on September 15, 2024, I thought we just had to wait out the ash cloud. I was wrong. The volcanic winter that followed turned my brewery into Fongwood Brewery into volcanic winter. Humanity's last hope, and I had to make choices that still haunt me. Over 90 days, I watched civilization collapse while fighting to keep my community alive in a world where summer would never return. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you about the 90 days that changed everything. My name is Joaquin Mendoza, and before the world ended, I was the master brewer and operations manager at Cascade Brewing Company in Portland, Oregon. I had built something I was proud of. 12 years of perfecting fermentation science, developing water purification systems that could rival any industrial operation, and creating a craft brewery that supplied half the restaurants in the Pearl District. My team of 15 employees had become like family. And every morning I would walk through those brewery doors knowing exactly what my day would bring. My grandfather used to tell me stories about surviving the hard times in Guadalajara, how he kept his small cerveceria running, even when the supply truck stopped coming and the power went out for weeks. He would say that a man who knows how to make clean water and preserve food will never starve, and his family will never thirst. I thought those were just old man stories, remnants of a Mexico that no longer existed. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The brewery had always been my obsession, but I took my preparation seriously in ways that probably seemed paranoid to most people. We had backup generators that could run the entire operation for 2 weeks. Our water purification system was designed to handle 3 times our normal capacity. I kept emergency supplies of grain, hops, and yeast cultures stored in temperature-controlled environments. My employees used to joke that I was preparing for the apocalypse, and I would laugh along with them. But deep down, my grandfather's voice would whisper that being prepared was never something to be ashamed of. Every Tuesday, I would call my sister Maria in San Diego. She was a trauma nurse at UC San Diego Medical Center, and she had inherited the same careful nature that ran in our family. We would talk about work, about life, about the news that always seemed to be getting worse. She would tell me about the medical supplies she kept at home, how she had learned to stockpile antibiotics and basic surgical equipment, because you never knew when the hospitals might get overwhelmed. I would tell her about my brewing experiments, how I was perfecting a fermentation process that could create high-proof alcohol suitable for fuel or antiseptic use. We were both preparing for something, though neither of us could have imagined what was coming. I had started keeping detailed journals about my brewing processes when I first took over the operation. Every batch, every temperature reading, every chemical balance was recorded with obsessive precision. My employees thought it was excessive, but I learned from watching my grandfather that knowledge dies with the person who holds it unless someone writes it down. I filled notebook after notebook with fermentation schedules, water treatment protocols, and equipment maintenance procedures. I told myself it was for training new employees, but something deeper drove me to document everything. September 15th started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at the brewery at 5:30 in the morning, an hour before my earliest employee. The fermentation tanks were humming quietly, the yeast cultures working their ancient magic to transform grain into alcohol. I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency, checking temperature gauges, testing pH levels, and monitoring the pressure systems that kept our operation running smoothly. The air smelled of malt and hops, a scent that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I was in the middle of checking our primary fermentation tank when the ground started moving. At first, I thought it was just a truck passing by on the street outside, but then the shaking intensified. The metal tank I was leaning against began to vibrate, and the liquid inside sloshed audibly. Equipment started rattling on the shelves, and I had to grab onto the tank to keep my balance. The shaking lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like the world was trying to tear itself apart. When it stopped, I immediately thought about our water systems. Any disruption to the delicate balance of our purification process could contaminate weeks of work. I rushed to the control room to check the monitoring equipment, but everything appeared normal. The generators were running smoothly, the water filters were operating within acceptable parameters, and the temperature controls were holding steady. My first instinct was always to protect the operation, to make sure our capabilities remained intact no matter what was happening outside. That's when I looked out the window and saw the sky. The western horizon was dark, not with storm clouds, but with something that looked like a massive wall of gray smoke rising higher than anything I had ever seen. It stretched across the entire mountain range, billowing upward in a column that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. I had lived in Oregon my entire adult life, and I had seen plenty of wildfire smoke, but this was different. This was bigger, darker, and moving toward us with unnatural speed. My phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. The first message made my blood run cold. Yellowstone supervolcano eruption confirmed. Seek immediate shelter. Ashfall expected in all northwestern states. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. Yellowstone wasn't just any volcano. It was the supervolcano that scientists had been monitoring for decades, the one that geologists said could end civilization if it ever erupted with full force. I immediately tried calling Maria, but the call went straight to voicemail. The cell towers were probably overwhelmed with people trying to reach their families. I tried again and again, but the network was completely jammed. I left a message, telling her I was safe, that I was staying at the brewery, and that she should head inland immediately if the eruption was as bad as they were saying. I had no idea that would be the last message I would ever leave for her. By 10 o'clock in the morning, my entire team had arrived at the brewery. Some had tried to go home after feeling the earthquake, but the roads were already clogged with people trying to evacuate the city. Others had families who lived too far away to reach safely. Without discussing it, we all seemed to understand that the brewery was where we needed to be. We had supplies, we had power, and we had each other. The ash cloud reached Portland around noon. What started as a strange gray haze on the horizon quickly thickened until it looked like twilight in the middle of the day. The temperature, which had been a comfortable 72 degrees that morning, began to drop noticeably. By 3 o'clock, it was down to 65 degrees. By evening, it had fallen to 58 degrees. The ash was falling like snow, coating everything in a fine gray powder that turned the familiar streets of Portland into an alien landscape. The news reports were chaotic and contradictory. Some stations were saying the eruption was contained, that the ash cloud would dissipate within a few days. Others were talking about a volcanic winter that could last months or even years. I remembered reading about similar eruptions in history, how they had caused crop failures and famines thousands of miles away from the volcano itself. But those were ancient events, stories from textbooks. This was happening now, and we were living through it. The first supply run happened on day 2. The grocery stores were already running low on essentials, and the line stretched for blocks. People were fighting over bottled water, canned goods, and batteries. I sent 2 of my employees with a company truck to buy as much non-perishable food as they could carry. They came back with grim faces, telling me that the stores were limiting purchases and that people were getting desperate. Some were offering to pay triple the normal price for basic supplies. That's when I realized our brewery's water purification system was going to be more valuable than gold. While everyone else was fighting over bottled water, we could produce clean, drinkable water indefinitely as long as we had power and raw materials. I started calculating how much water we could produce per day, how many people we could supply, and how long our backup generators could keep the system running if the power grid failed. The military vehicles started appearing on day 3. Humvees and transport trucks rolled through the streets, their loudspeakers announcing evacuation orders for certain neighborhoods. But the roads leading out of the city were completely gridlocked, and many people were choosing to stay in their homes rather than risk getting trapped in the traffic. I watched from the brewery windows as convoys passed by, and something about the way the soldiers looked at the buildings made me nervous. They weren't just maintaining order. They were assessing resources. By day 4, the power grid was becoming unstable. We experienced several brownouts, and the electrical company was warning that rolling blackouts might be necessary to prevent total system failure. I made the decision to switch to our backup generators during the peak usage hours, conserving our fuel while keeping our critical systems running. The generators were loud, but they provided the steady power we needed to maintain our fermentation processes and water purification systems. The temperature continued to drop. By the end of the first week, it had fallen to 45 degrees, and the ash was still falling steadily. The local weather service was no longer providing regular forecasts. Instead, they were broadcasting emergency information about air quality and visibility. The ash was so thick that driving had become dangerous, and the airport had been closed indefinitely. I started monitoring radio frequencies, trying to get information from sources beyond the local news. There were reports of similar conditions across the entire Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, and parts of the Midwest. The ash cloud was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and the temperature drops were more severe than the initial models had suggested. Some of the emergency broadcasts were talking about a volcanic winter that could last 6 months or more. During the second week, neighbors began showing up at the brewery. Word had spread that we had power, heat, and clean water. At first, it was just a few people asking to charge their phones or fill water containers. But as the conditions outside worsened, more people began asking if they could stay. These weren't strangers. They were business owners from the neighborhood, regular customers who had supported us for years, families with children who had nowhere else to go. I found myself making decisions I had never imagined I would have to make. How many people could we realistically support? How long would our supplies last if we kept taking in refugees? What happened when the food ran out? My grandfather's stories suddenly didn't seem like ancient history. They were a guide for the choices I was facing every day. The brewery's layout worked in our favor. We had a large production floor that could accommodate sleeping areas, a kitchen facility that could prepare meals for a crowd, and storage areas that could be converted into private spaces for families. Most importantly, we had the infrastructure to support a small community. Our water systems could handle increased demand, our generators could provide power for essential needs, and our brewing equipment could be repurposed for food preservation and other survival tasks. I started organizing the people staying with us into work groups. Some focused on food preparation and rationing. Others took responsibility for maintaining the building's security and monitoring the radio for emergency information. A few people with medical training set up a basic first aid station using supplies we had scrounged from nearby pharmacies and medical offices. Everyone had a role, and everyone contributed to our collective survival. The radio chatter was becoming more interesting and more disturbing. There were reports of organized groups forming in different parts of the city, some focused on mutual aid and others on resource acquisition. I heard transmissions from what sounded like military or paramilitary organizations talking about consolidation phases and resource management. The language was coded, but the implication was clear. Some groups were preparing to take what they needed by force. By day 15, we had 43 people living in the brewery. The temperature outside had dropped to 38 degrees, and the ash was still falling intermittently. The city's water system was starting to fail in some neighborhoods, and The power grid was barely functional. Our backup generators were running almost continuously, and I was starting to worry about our fuel supplies. I began teaching some of the people in our group about basic brewing and fermentation processes. Not because I expected them to become brewers, but because the knowledge might save their lives. Fermentation could preserve food when refrigeration wasn't available. Alcohol production could provide fuel for heating and cooking. Water purification could prevent disease when municipal systems failed. These weren't just brewing techniques anymore. They were survival skills. The first death happened on day 16. An elderly man who had been staying with us developed pneumonia, and we didn't have the medical supplies or expertise to treat him properly. He died quietly in his sleep, and we buried him in the small garden behind the brewery. It was the first time I truly understood that we weren't just riding out a temporary emergency. We were living through the collapse of the world we had known. The radio reports were getting worse. The ash cloud was continuing to spread, and the temperature drops were more severe than anyone had predicted. Scientists were starting to use terms like volcanic winter and climate disruption to describe what was happening. Some were suggesting that the effects could last for years, not months. The growing season was over before it had begun, and global food supplies were going to be severely impacted. I tried calling Maria again on day 17, but the call wouldn't go through. The telecommunications infrastructure was failing as power grids collapsed and cell towers went offline. I left messages on every platform I could think of, hoping that somehow she would receive them and know that I was alive. I told her about the brewery, about the people we were helping, about the water purification systems that were keeping us alive. I wanted her to know that if she could make it to Portland, we would have a place for her. By day 18, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees, and we saw the first frost forming on the windows. Frost in September in Portland was unheard of, but nothing about our situation was normal anymore. The ash was still falling, though less consistently than before. The sky remained dark during what should have been daylight hours, and the sun was completely blocked by the ash cloud. The people in our group were starting to understand that this wasn't a temporary emergency. We weren't going to be rescued by the government or evacuated to a safe location. We were on our own, and we needed to prepare for a long-term survival situation. I began sharing more of my grandfather's stories, the lessons he had learned about community survival during times of crisis. The people who would survive were those who worked together, who shared resources, and who planned for the worst while hoping for the best. I started keeping more detailed records of everything we were doing, not just the brewing and water purification processes, but the social dynamics, the resource management, the decision-making processes that kept our community functioning. I had a feeling that this information might be valuable to other groups of survivors, and I wanted to document what worked and what didn't. The journal entries were becoming a guide for surviving in a world that no longer followed the old rules. The supply runs were getting more dangerous. The roads were treacherous with ash accumulation, and there were reports of robberies and violence as people became more desperate. I organized our scavenging operations like military missions, with specific objectives, safety protocols, and backup plans. We targeted medical supplies, non-perishable food, fuel, and equipment that could be useful for our long-term survival. On one of these supply runs, we encountered another organized group for the first time. They were led by a man who introduced himself as Commander Hayes, a former military officer who had gathered about 30 people in a fortified compound several miles from the brewery. He was polite but direct, explaining that they were focused on efficient resource management and strategic survival planning. He talked about the need to make hard choices and the importance of strong leadership during crisis situations. Hayes was interested in our water purification capabilities, and he made what he called a mutual assistance proposal. His group had access to weapons and military supplies, and they could provide security for our operations in exchange for access to our water systems. I told him we would consider his offer, but something about the way he talked about hard choices and strategic survival made me uncomfortable. I had the feeling that his definition of cooperation might be different from mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees, and I could hear the wind rattling the windows of the brewery. I walked through the building, checking on the people sleeping in makeshift beds throughout the production floor. Families huddled together for warmth, individuals wrapped in whatever blankets and clothing they could find. These were good people. Neighbors and friends who had trusted me to help them survive. The responsibility was overwhelming. I found myself thinking about Maria, wondering if she was alive, if she had found somewhere safe to stay. San Diego was far enough south that the ash cloud might not have reached there yet, and the temperatures might not have dropped as severely. But I knew that even if she was physically safe, she was probably dealing with the same kinds of difficult decisions I was facing. Medical supplies would be running low, hospitals would be overwhelmed, and she would be trying to help as many people as possible with limited resources. The radio was quiet except for the automated emergency broadcasts that repeated the same information over and over. Seek shelter, conserve resources, wait for further instructions. But there were no further instructions coming. The government agencies that were supposed to coordinate disaster response were probably dealing with their own survival situations. We were truly on our own. As I sat in the brewery's office, looking at the temperature gauge that showed 25 degrees outside, I realized that everything was about to change. The frost on the windows was becoming ice, and the ash was mixing with moisture to create a gray slush that coated everything. This wasn't the end of the emergency. This was the beginning of something much worse. I opened my journal and began writing about what I expected to happen next. The temperature would continue dropping, the ash would keep falling, and the infrastructure that supported modern civilization would continue to fail. Food would become scarce, fuel would run out, and people would become increasingly desperate. The groups that survived would be those that could adapt quickly, work together effectively, and make the difficult decisions that circumstances demanded. I wrote about Commander Hayes and his offer of protection in exchange for access to our water systems. I wrote about the military vehicles that continued to patrol the streets, and the way the soldiers looked at buildings like they were assessing their strategic value. I wrote about the radio transmissions that talked about consolidation phases and resource management. I had the feeling that the worst was yet to come, and I wanted to document what I was thinking and feeling while I still could. The wind outside was getting stronger, and the building creaked and groaned as it was battered by the storm. But inside the brewery, our generators hummed steadily. Our water purification systems continued to function, and the people under our protection slept as safely as anyone could in this new world. We had survived the first 18 days, but I knew that the real test was just beginning. The morning of day 19 brought something I had never seen before in Oregon: snow. Not the light dusting we might get once or twice a winter, but heavy, wet snow that accumulated rapidly on the ash-covered streets. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees overnight, and our heating systems were working overtime to keep the brewery warm, enough for the 43 people now depending on us for survival. I stood at the window watching the snow fall, and I realized that my understanding of our situation had been completely wrong. This wasn't a temporary emergency that would resolve itself in a few weeks or months. The volcanic winter was settling over us like a permanent blanket, and we needed to start thinking about long-term survival in a world where summer might never return. The first death from the cold happened that morning. A woman in her 70s who had been staying with us for a week simply didn't wake up. She had gone to sleep normally the night before, but hypothermia had taken her during the night, despite our best efforts to keep everyone warm. We found her peaceful, almost like she was still sleeping. but her skin was cold to the touch, and her breathing had stopped sometime before dawn. We buried her next to the elderly man who had died of pneumonia, creating what was becoming a small cemetery in the garden behind the brewery. I said a few words about her kindness and the way she had helped with food preparation, but the reality was that none of us knew much about her life before the eruption. She had become part of our community in crisis, and now she was gone. I wondered how many more graves we would need to dig before winter ended. The radio traffic was becoming more organized and more concerning. The random emergency broadcasts were being replaced by structured communications between what sounded like military units and civilian groups. I heard references to resource consolidation areas and population management zones. The language was bureaucratic, but the implication was clear. Someone was organizing the survivors into controllable groups, and they were assessing which resources were worth protecting. Commander Hayes contacted us again on day 21. This time, he didn't come to the brewery personally. Instead, he sent 2 of his people to deliver a message. They were polite but firm, explaining that Hayes Group was expanding their protective operations and that they wanted to formalize their relationship with us. They had identified our water purification capabilities as strategically essential, and they were prepared to provide security services in exchange for exclusive access to our systems. I told Hayes representatives that we needed time to consider their proposal, but privately, I was becoming more worried about their intentions. The way they talked about exclusive access suggested they weren't interested in cooperation. They wanted control. I had seen enough movies and read enough history to know that when armed groups start talking about protecting resources, they usually mean taking them. That night, I gathered the core leadership of our community to discuss the situation. We had naturally organized ourselves into a small council that made decisions about resource allocation, security, and long-term planning. The group included 2 of my original employees, a former restaurant manager who had become our food coordinator, a retired nurse who managed our medical supplies, and a construction worker who had taken responsibility for maintaining the building's infrastructure. We talked about Hayes' proposal in the context of our broader survival strategy. Our water purification system was indeed our most valuable asset, but it was also what made us a target. Other groups knew we had clean water, and as the municipal systems continued to fail, our capabilities would become even more attractive to people who were willing to take what they needed by force. The construction worker, whose name was Frank, had experience with building security systems. He suggested that we needed to make the brewery more defensible while appearing to remain open to cooperation with groups like Hayes. We could reinforce the entrances, create secondary exits, and establish positions that would give us advantages if we needed to defend ourselves. But we had to be careful not to appear too militaristic, or we might provoke the exact confrontation we were trying to avoid. During the 4th week, the temperature stabilized around 5 degrees below zero. The snow continued to fall intermittently, mixing with the ash to create a gray slush that made outdoor movement treacherous. Our heating systems were consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and I was starting to worry about our ability to keep everyone warm through what was clearly going to be a long winter. I began experimenting with ways to use our brewing equipment for food preservation. The fermentation processes that I had perfected for alcohol production could be adapted to preserve vegetables, create nutritious broths, and even produce limited amounts of vitamins from available materials. My grandfather had used similar techniques during the hard times in Mexico, and I was grateful for the stories he had told me about making the most of scarce resources. The knowledge I was gaining from these experiments felt important in ways that went beyond our immediate survival. I was learning to create systems that could sustain a community without depending on external supply chains or industrial infrastructure. These weren't just brewing techniques anymore. They were the foundation for rebuilding civilization on a smaller, more sustainable scale. I started teaching these preservation methods to others in our group, partly to spread the knowledge and partly to prepare for the possibility that something might happen to me. The retired nurse, whose name was Eleanor, was particularly interested in the medicinal applications of fermentation. She had found references to traditional remedies that use controlled fermentation to create antibiotics and other therapeutic compounds. The radio chatter was revealing more about the broader situation. There were reports of organized conflict between survivor groups in other cities, competition for resources that had escalated into violence. Some groups were trying to establish territorial control over specific areas, while others were focused on raiding and resource extraction. Social order that had held civilization together was breaking down, and people were reverting to more primitive forms of organization. Commander Hayes made his third contact on day 28. This time, he came to the brewery personally, accompanied by 6 armed men. He was still polite, but there was an edge to his conversation that hadn't been there before. He explained that his group was growing rapidly and that they needed to formalize agreements with resource providers to ensure everyone's security during the transition period. Hayes was more direct about his expectations. He wanted access to our water purification systems for his expanded group, and he wanted assurances that we wouldn't provide similar services to other organizations without his approval. In exchange, he would provide security for our operations and protection from other groups that might threaten our community. He used phrases like mutual benefit and strategic partnership, but the men with weapons standing behind him made his real message clear. I told Hayes that we appreciated his offer, but that we needed to maintain our independence to serve the broader community. Our water systems were operating at capacity to support the people already staying with us, and we couldn't commit to exclusive arrangements with outside groups. I tried to be diplomatic, but I could see that my response didn't satisfy him. After Hayes left, I called another meeting of our leadership council. The situation was becoming more dangerous, and we needed to prepare for the possibility that Hayes would try to take what he wanted by force. Frank suggested that we needed to create contingency plans for defending the brewery, but also backup plans for evacuating our people if the situation became hopeless. The reality was that we were in a vulnerable position. We had valuable resources, but we weren't a military organization. Most of our people were ordinary civilians who had come together for mutual survival, not trained fighters who could repel an armed assault. Our advantages were our knowledge of the building, our essential infrastructure, and our motivation to protect the community we had built. I began working on detailed documentation of our water purification systems, our food preservation techniques, and our community organization methods. I wasn't just keeping records for historical purposes anymore. I was creating a manual that could help other groups survive if something happened to us. The knowledge we had gained couldn't be allowed to die with us. The 5th week brought the first signs of organized violence in our area. We heard gunshots several nights in a row, and there were reports on the radio of confrontations between different survivor groups. Some of the people who had been staying with us started talking about leaving Portland entirely, trying to reach relatives in other states or finding warmer climates where survival might be easier. I understood their desire to leave, but I also knew that travel was becoming increasingly dangerous. The roads were barely passable, fuel was scarce, and there were reports of armed groups controlling major highways. The people who left our community might find themselves in worse situations than the one they were trying to escape. Eleanor, our retired nurse, had been monitoring the health of everyone in our group, and she was seeing signs of malnutrition and stress-related illness. Our food supplies were adequate in terms of calories, but we weren't getting the variety of nutrients needed for long-term health. She suggested that we needed to find ways to supplement our diet with preserved foods that could provide vitamins and minerals. I started experimenting with sprouting techniques that could produce fresh vegetables even in our controlled indoor environment. The process used minimal resources and could provide essential nutrients that were missing from our canned and dried food supplies. It was another example of how traditional knowledge could be adapted to modern survival situations. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero during the 6th week, and our fuel consumption was becoming critical. We were burning through our reserves faster than I had anticipated, and I was starting to worry about our ability to maintain heating through the entire winter. I made the difficult decision to reduce the heated areas of the brewery, concentrating everyone in the main production floor, and shutting down heating to the outer sections of the building. The psychological pressure was becoming as challenging as the physical survival issues. People were living in close quarters with limited privacy, uncertain about their families and friends outside the brewery, and dealing with the constant stress of knowing that our situation could become much worse at any time. I was seeing conflicts between individuals, depression, and anxiety that threatened the cohesion of our group. I found myself thinking about Maria more often during this period. She had dealt with trauma and crisis as part of her job as a nurse, and she had taught me about the importance of maintaining mental health during difficult situations. I tried to apply her lessons to our community, organizing activities that gave people purpose and creating routines that provided structure and stability. The radio reports were becoming more ominous. There were descriptions of resource wars between different survivor groups, accounts of communities being raided and destroyed, and warnings about the breakdown of law and order in many areas. The government agencies that had initially coordinated disaster response were no longer broadcasting, and the military units that had been patrolling the streets were apparently being reassigned to other priorities. Commander Hayes sent another message on day 34, but this time he didn't come personally. Instead, 2 of his people delivered a written ultimatum. Hayes Group had identified our water purification systems as essential infrastructure for their expanding operations, and they were prepared to assume control of our facility for the greater good of the survivor community. We had 48 hours to accept their protection or face the consequences of our irresponsible independence. I knew that the ultimatum was really a declaration of war. Hayes had decided that negotiation was no longer worth his time, and he was preparing to take what he wanted by force. The 48-hour deadline was probably intended to give us time to evacuate voluntarily, which would make his takeover easier and less costly for his group. I gathered our leadership council for an emergency meeting, and we discussed our options. We could try to negotiate further with Hayes, but his ultimatum suggested that he was no longer interested in compromise. We could attempt to defend the brewery, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. We could evacuate and try to establish ourselves elsewhere, but we would lose the infrastructure that was keeping us alive. Frank suggested that we had one advantage Hayes might not have considered. We knew the brewery's systems better than anyone else, and we could potentially disable them if we were forced to abandon the building. If Hayes wanted our water purification capabilities, he would need people who understood how to operate and maintain them. We could make ourselves valuable enough to survive a takeover, or we could make the facility useless to him if he tried to take it by force. I spent that night walking through the brewery, looking at the equipment and systems that had become the foundation of our survival. The fermentation tanks, the water purification systems, the generators, the heating equipment. All of it was familiar to me in ways that went beyond technical knowledge. These machines had become part of my identity, the tools that had transformed me from a brewer into a community leader. I also spent time talking with the people who had become my responsibility. Families with children, elderly individuals, young adults who had never imagined they would need to fight for survival. They trusted me to make decisions that would keep them alive, and I was about to make choices that could determine whether they lived or died. The radio traffic that night included communications between Hayes Group and other organizations in the area. They were coordinating their operations, sharing information about resources and potential targets. I heard references to other communities that had been consolidated into Hayes' expanding network, and I began to understand that we weren't his only target. He was systematically taking control of survival resources throughout the region. I made the decision to start preparing for a siege. We couldn't prevent Hayes from attacking, but we could make it expensive for him and possibly convince him that cooperation was more valuable than conquest. Frank and I began organizing defensive positions, creating barriers that would slow down attackers and give us advantages in any confrontation. At the same time, I was documenting everything we had learned about community survival, the techniques for water purification, food preservation, resource management, and group organization. I was writing it all down in detail, creating a guide that could help other survivors, even if our community didn't survive what was coming. The second night after receiving Hayes' ultimatum, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the brewery checking on people, making sure our security watches were alert, and trying to prepare myself mentally for what might happen. The temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind was howling through the empty streets of Portland. I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories, about how he had defended his small brewery during the difficult times in Mexico. He had told me that the key to survival wasn't just having resources, but being willing to protect them when necessary. He had also said that sometimes the best victory was the one you achieved without fighting, by making your opponents realize that the cost of conflict was higher than the value of what they wanted to take. As I sat in the brewery's office on the morning of day 36, I realized that we were about to find out whether the community we had built was strong enough to survive its first real test. The temperature gauge outside showed 22 degrees below zero, and the snow was falling heavily again. But inside the brewery, our generators were running, our water systems were functioning, and the people under our protection were as safe as anyone could be in this new world. I opened my journal and began writing about what I expected to happen next. Hayes would come with his armed men, and we would have to choose between submission and resistance. Either way, nothing would be the same after tomorrow. The comfortable period of building our community was ending, and the real struggle for survival was about to begin. The 48 hours Hayes had given us passed without any communication from his group, but I knew that didn't mean we were safe. On the morning of day 37, I discovered that someone had been stealing from our medical supplies. Eleanor noticed that several bottles of antibiotics and pain medication were missing from our carefully rationed stock. This wasn't a case of someone taking an extra aspirin. Someone had deliberately taken enough medication to treat serious injuries or trade for other resources. I called an emergency meeting of our leadership council to discuss the theft. The missing supplies weren't just valuable for their medical applications. They were also the kind of high-value items that could be used to buy protection or safe passage from groups like Hayes' organization. The timing of the theft, coming so soon after Hayes' ultimatum, made me suspect that someone in our community was preparing to abandon us or possibly even cooperating with our enemies. Frank suggested that we needed to conduct a thorough search of everyone's personal belongings, but Eleanor argued that violating people's privacy would destroy the trust that held our community together. We were facing the first serious internal crisis since the eruption, and how we handled it would determine whether we could maintain the cooperative spirit that had kept us alive. I made the decision to address the theft openly with the entire community. I gathered everyone in the main production area and explained what had happened. I didn't accuse anyone specifically, but I made it clear that stealing essential supplies endangered everyone's survival. I also explained that if someone needed medical treatment, they should come to Eleanor rather than trying to self-medicate with stolen drugs. The response was mixed. Most people seemed genuinely shocked that someone would steal from the group. But I noticed several individuals who wouldn't make eye contact during my speech. One young man named Derek, who had joined us during the third week, seemed particularly nervous. He had been asking questions about our security procedures and our relationships with other survivor groups, and I was starting to wonder about his motivations for staying with us. That afternoon, Derek approached me privately and confessed that he had taken the medical supplies. He explained that his girlfriend was staying with another survivor group across town, and she had developed a serious infection that needed antibiotic treatment. He had planned to trade the medication for her safe passage to our brewery, but he realized that his theft had compromised our entire community's security. I was faced with my first major disciplinary decision as the leader of our group. Derek had stolen essential supplies and endangered everyone's survival, but he had also confessed voluntarily, and his motivation was understandable. My grandfather's stories included examples of how communities dealt with internal conflicts, and the lessons weren't always simple. Sometimes mercy was more valuable than justice, but sometimes examples needed to be set to maintain order. I decided to give Derek a choice. He could leave our community immediately and take his chances on his own, or he could stay and work off his debt by taking on additional responsibilities for community security. If he chose to stay, he would be on probation for 30 days, during which any further violations would result in immediate expulsion. I also made it clear that his confession had probably saved him from much harsher consequences. Derek chose to stay, and I assigned him to work with Frank on improving our defensive preparations. It was a calculated risk, but I believed that giving him a chance to redeem himself would send the right message to the rest of the community. We couldn't afford to lose people unnecessarily, but we also couldn't tolerate behavior that threatened our collective survival. The incident with Derek made me realize that Commander Hayes' pressure was already affecting our internal dynamics. The stress of knowing that we might be attacked was causing people to make desperate decisions, and I needed to address the psychological impact of our situation before it undermined our community from within. I started holding daily meetings where people could voice their concerns and discuss potential solutions to our problems. The meetings served multiple purposes. They gave everyone a chance to participate in decision-making. They provided information about our situation and plans, and they helped identify potential problems before they became serious threats to our survival. On day 39, we received our first concrete intelligence about Hayes' preparations. A woman named Sarah, who had been scavenging in the industrial district, reported seeing a large group of armed men setting up what looked like a staging area in a warehouse about 2 miles from the brewery. They had vehicles, weapons, and equipment that suggested they were preparing for a sustained operation. Sarah had managed to get close enough to overhear some of their conversations, and what she heard was disturbing. Hayes people were talking about resource extraction and population management in ways that suggested they weren't planning to negotiate with us. They were preparing to take control of our facility and either force us to work for them or remove us entirely. I realized that we needed better intelligence about Hayes' capabilities and intentions. I organized a reconnaissance team consisting of Frank, Derek, and 2 other volunteers who had experience with outdoor activities. Their mission was to observe Hayes' staging area and gather information about his numbers, equipment, and timeline for any potential attack. The reconnaissance team left before dawn on day 40, using the cover of darkness and falling snow to avoid detection. They were equipped with binoculars, radios, and warm clothing, but they were also taking significant risks. If Hayes people captured them, it would not only cost us valuable community members, but also provide our enemies with information about our defensive preparations. While the reconnaissance team was gathering intelligence, I focused on preparing our community for the possibility of siege or attack. We moved our most essential supplies to secure storage areas within the brewery, and we established protocols for communication and coordination during emergency situations. Everyone was assigned specific roles and responsibilities, from defending key positions to caring for children and elderly community members. I also began preparing more detailed documentation of our water purification and food preservation systems. If Hayes succeeded in taking control of our facility, he would need technical knowledge to operate our equipment effectively. I could use that knowledge as leverage to protect our people, or I could potentially sabotage the systems to deny him the resources he wanted. The reconnaissance team returned on the evening of day 41 with sobering information. Hayes had assembled a force of approximately 40 armed men, along with vehicles and equipment that included military-style weapons and communication gear. They had established a command post in the warehouse and were conducting what appeared to be planning sessions for an operation against our brewery. More concerning was the timeline they had overheard. Hayes people were talking about launching their operation within the next 48 hours, possibly as early as the following night. They were waiting for additional personnel and equipment to arrive, but they seemed confident that they had overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower. Frank reported that Hayes' staging area was well organized and defensible, suggesting that his group had significant military experience and resources. They weren't just desperate survivors trying to take what they needed. They were an organized force that was systematically expanding their control over the region's survival resources. I called an emergency meeting of our entire community to discuss the intelligence we had gathered and our options for responding to the threat. I presented the situation honestly, explaining that Hayes had superior numbers and equipment, but that we had advantages in defensive position and knowledge of our facility. I also made it clear that everyone needed to understand the risks involved in any decision we made. The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. Some people argued that we should try to negotiate with Hayes, offering to share our resources in exchange for protection and autonomy. Others believed that any cooperation with Hayes would eventually lead to our enslavement or elimination, and that we needed to fight regardless of the odds. Eleanor, our retired nurse, raised a point that I hadn't fully considered. She argued that our real advantage wasn't our defensive position or our technical knowledge, but our value as skilled personnel. Hayes might be able to take our equipment, but he couldn't replace the expertise needed to operate and maintain our systems. If we could convince him that we were more valuable as partners than as conquered subjects, we might be able to negotiate from a position of strength. I realized that Eleanor was right, but I also understood that any negotiation with Hayes would be extremely dangerous. If he decided that our cooperation wasn't worth the effort, or if he believed he could force us to work for him through threats and intimidation, we would have given up our defensive advantages without gaining any real security. After hours of discussion, we reached a consensus on our response strategy. We would prepare to defend the brewery, but we would also be ready to negotiate if Hayes was willing to discuss terms that preserved our community's autonomy and safety. Most importantly, we would not surrender our technical knowledge or our essential personnel under any circumstances. Frank and Derek worked through the night to complete our defensive preparations. They had identified key positions that would allow us to control access to the brewery, and they had created barriers and obstacles that would slow down any attack. They had also established communication protocols that would allow us to coordinate our response and call for help if necessary. I spent the night making final preparations to the documentation of our systems and procedures. I created multiple copies of the technical manuals, hiding them in different locations throughout the brewery. If Hayes succeeded in taking control of our facility, he would still need our cooperation to make full use of our capabilities, and I wanted to ensure that I had bargaining chips that could protect our people. On the morning of day 42, the temperature had dropped to 25 degrees below zero, and the snow was falling heavily. The weather conditions would make any attack more difficult, but they would also limit our options for evacuation or escape if our defensive plans failed. We were committed to defending our position, regardless of the outcome. I gathered our community for what might be our final meeting before Hayes' attack. I wanted everyone to understand their roles and responsibilities. But I also wanted to remind them of what we were fighting to protect. We had built something valuable in the brewery, not just the technical systems that kept us alive, but the community relationships that made survival meaningful. The attack began just after midnight on day 43. Hayes people approached the brewery in vehicles, using their headlights to illuminate our defensive positions while they deployed around the building. They had obviously planned their assault carefully, and they moved with military precision that confirmed our intelligence about their capabilities and experience. Frank had anticipated their tactics, and our defensive positions were designed to force them into predictable patterns of movement. We had created obstacles that channeled their approach into areas where we could concentrate our limited firepower, and we had established fallback positions that would allow us to continue resisting even if they breached our outer defenses. The initial assault focused on the main entrance to the brewery, where Hayes people used vehicles to ram through our barriers and create entry points for their ground forces. We responded with improvised weapons and defensive measures that Frank had prepared, including barriers that could be activated to block their advance and positions that gave us advantages in close quarters fighting. The battle lasted approximately 4 hours, during which we managed to inflict significant casualties on Hayes' forces while suffering losses of our own. Derek was seriously wounded while defending one of our key positions, and 2 other community members were killed during the fighting. Eleanor worked frantically to treat the wounded with our limited medical supplies, including the antibiotics that Derek had previously stolen and returned. By dawn, Hayes people had gained control of the main production area, but we had retreated to secondary positions that controlled access to our essential systems. The water purification equipment, the generators, and the food storage areas were all in sections of the brewery that remained under our control, which meant that Hayes had won a tactical victory but not achieved his strategic objectives. Commander, Hayes requested a meeting to discuss terms for ending the fighting. He had obviously expected to overwhelm us quickly, and the resistance we had mounted was more costly than he had anticipated. I agreed to meet with him in the main production area, accompanied by Frank and Eleanor as representatives of our community's interests. Hayes was professional but clearly frustrated by our resistance. He explained that his organization was focused on building sustainable communities for long-term survival, and that our technical capabilities were essential for supporting larger populations. He argued that our insistence on independence was selfish and ultimately self-defeating because isolated communities couldn't survive the challenges of the volcanic winter. I responded that our community had proven its ability to survive and thrive through cooperation and mutual support, and that we were willing to share our knowledge and resources with other groups, but not under conditions that amounted to surrender. I proposed that Hayes' organization and our community could work together as partners, with each group maintaining autonomy while sharing resources and expertise. The negotiation revealed the fundamental difference between Hayes' approach to survival and ours. He believed that strong central authority was necessary to make the hard choices required for long-term survival, while we believed that voluntary cooperation and mutual support were more sustainable and more consistent with human dignity. Hayes ultimately agreed to a temporary ceasefire while he consulted with his superiors about our proposal for partnership rather than conquest. He withdrew most of his forces from the brewery, but left a small contingent to monitor our activities and ensure that we didn't use the time to strengthen our defenses or contact other survivor groups for assistance. During the 3-day ceasefire, I worked frantically to document everything we had learned about community defense and crisis negotiation. The battle with Hayes had taught us valuable lessons about the importance of preparation, the effectiveness of different defensive strategies, and the psychological factors that influence success or failure in conflict situations. I also spent time treating our wounded and trying to maintain morale among our community members. The attack had been traumatic for everyone, but it had also demonstrated that we could defend ourselves against superior forces when we worked together effectively. Derek's courage during the fighting had redeemed him completely in the eyes of our community, and his recovery was becoming a symbol of our resilience. Eleanor was struggling with the medical challenges of treating serious injuries with limited supplies and no access to hospital facilities. She was learning to improvise surgical procedures and pharmaceutical treatments using whatever materials were available, and her success in saving Derek's life had established her as an essential leader within our community. On the final day of the ceasefire, Hayes returned with his answer. His superiors had rejected our proposal for partnership, insisting that resource consolidation required unified command and control. However, they were willing to offer us positions within their organization with guarantees of safety and adequate supplies in exchange for our technical expertise and cooperation. I knew that accepting Hayes' offer would mean the end of our independent community, but I also understood that rejecting it would probably mean renewed fighting that we might not survive. I called a final meeting of our community to discuss the choice we faced, and the decision we made would determine not only our immediate survival, but also our long-term future in the new world that was emerging from the volcanic winter. The meeting lasted through the night, with every member of our community participating in the discussion. We talked about the values that had brought us together, the relationships we had built, and the kind of future we wanted to create for ourselves and for the generations that might follow us. By morning, we had reached a decision that would put everything we had built to the ultimate test. Our community voted to reject Hayes' offer. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it was clear. We had built something worth defending, and we weren't willing to trade our independence for the promise of security under someone else's control. I knew that this choice would probably cost us dearly, but I also knew that survival without dignity wasn't really survival at all. When I delivered our answer to Commander Hayes on the morning of Day 47, his response was exactly what I had expected. He gave us 24 hours to reconsider, but his tone made it clear that he viewed our rejection as a declaration of war. His forces would return in greater numbers, and they would not offer terms again. We had chosen resistance, and we would face the consequences of that choice. The 24-hour deadline created the most intense pressure our community had ever experienced. Some people began to question whether we had made the right decision, and others started talking about leaving the brewery before the fighting resumed. I understood their fears, but I also knew that abandoning our position would mean certain death in the sub-zero temperatures that now dominated our world. Frank and I spent the day making final preparations for what would probably be our last stand. We had learned valuable lessons from the previous battle, and we used that knowledge to improve our defensive positions and develop new tactics that might give us advantages despite being outnumbered. We also prepared contingency plans for destroying our essential equipment if it became clear that Hayes would succeed in taking control of the brewery. The decision to potentially destroy our water purification systems was the most difficult choice I had made since the eruption began. Those systems were keeping our community alive, and they represented months of careful maintenance and improvement. But I also knew that allowing Hayes to capture our capabilities intact would give him resources that he could use to dominate other survivor communities throughout the region. Eleanor was working frantically to prepare medical supplies for the casualties we expected to suffer during the renewed fighting. She had been experimenting with traditional remedies and improvised treatments that could extend our limited pharmaceutical supplies, and she was teaching basic first aid techniques to community members who might need to treat injuries during the battle. Derek had recovered enough from his wounds to participate in our defensive preparations, and his experience during the previous fighting had made him one of our most effective tactical planners. He was working with Frank to develop strategies that would maximize the effectiveness of our limited resources while minimizing our exposure to Hayes' superior firepower. I was spending my time documenting everything we had learned about community survival, defensive tactics, and crisis leadership. I knew that our community might not survive the coming battle, but I wanted to ensure that our knowledge and experience could help other groups of survivors who were facing similar challenges. The journal entries I was writing had become more than personal records. They were a guide for rebuilding civilization in a world that had been fundamentally changed by the volcanic winter. The temperature on day 48 dropped to 30 degrees below zero, the coldest we had experienced since the eruption. Our heating systems were struggling to maintain livable conditions inside. The brewery and our fuel supplies were running dangerously low. The extreme cold would make fighting more difficult for both sides, but it would also limit our options for evacuation or escape if our defensive plans failed. That evening, I received an unexpected radio transmission from a group calling themselves the Portland Resistance Network. They had been monitoring communications between Hayes' organization and other military groups in the region, and they were offering to provide assistance during our expected battle. The transmission was brief and cryptic, but it suggested that we weren't the only community that was resisting Hayes' expansion. I was cautious about accepting help from unknown groups, but I was also realistic about our chances of surviving another attack without additional support. I responded to the radio transmission with basic information about our situation and our defensive capabilities, while being careful not to reveal details that could be used against us if the communication was being monitored by Hayes people. The Portland Resistance Network contacted us again just after midnight on day 49, providing more specific information about their organization and their capabilities. They were a loose alliance of survivor communities that had formed to resist military groups like Hayes' organization, and they had been conducting guerrilla operations against resource raiders throughout the region. Their leader, a woman who identified herself only as Phoenix, explained that they had been planning an operation against Hayes' main base for several weeks, and that our battle with his forces could provide the distraction they needed to launch their attack. If we could hold out for 6 hours after Hayes' assault began, their strike against his base might force him to withdraw forces from our area to defend his primary operations. The coordination with the Portland Resistance Network gave us hope, but it also added complexity to our defensive planning. We needed to hold our positions long enough for their operation to take effect, but we also needed to be prepared for the possibility that their attack might fail or be delayed. We were still fundamentally dependent on our own resources and capabilities for survival. Frank and Derek spent the pre-dawn hours of day 49 making final adjustments to our defensive positions. They had created a series of fallback lines that would allow us to continue resisting, even if Hayes' forces breached our outer defenses, and they had established communication protocols that would allow us to coordinate with the Portland Resistance Network during the battle. I gathered our community for what I knew might be our final meeting. I wanted everyone to understand the situation we faced and the choices they would need to make during the coming hours. Some people would be fighting to defend our positions, others would be caring for children and elderly community members, and everyone would be contributing to our collective survival in whatever way they could. The attack began at dawn on day 49, with Hayes launching a coordinated assault using nearly 60 armed personnel and multiple vehicles. His forces had obviously been reinforced since our previous battle, and they moved with the confidence of a group that expected to overwhelm our defenses quickly and decisively. Our defensive strategy focused on delaying tactics rather than trying to stop Hayes' advance entirely. We used obstacles, improvised explosives, and coordinated small unit actions to slow down his forces and inflict casualties, while preserving our own personnel for the extended fighting that we knew was coming. The battle progressed through several phases, with Hayes' forces gradually gaining control of different sections of the brewery, while we retreated to prepared positions deeper within the building. The fighting was intense and personal, with combat taking place at close range in corridors and production areas that had become as familiar to us as our own homes. Derek was leading the defense of our main fallback position when he was critically wounded by gunfire from Hayes' assault team. Eleanor worked desperately to save his life while the fighting continued around her, using medical supplies that we couldn't afford to lose and techniques that she had learned through trial and error. During our weeks of isolation, by noon, Hayes' forces had gained control of most of the brewery, but we still held the sections that contained our essential equipment. The water purification systems, the generators, and the food storage areas were all in positions that we could defend or destroy if necessary. Hayes had won another tactical victory, but he still hadn't achieved his strategic objective of capturing our capabilities intact. Commander Hayes called for another ceasefire and requested a meeting to discuss final terms. He was clearly frustrated by our continued resistance, and the casualties his forces had suffered were obviously higher than he had expected. I agreed to meet with him, but I also activated the dead man switch that would destroy our essential equipment if I didn't return within 2 hours. The meeting took place in the main production area, which was now controlled by Hayes' forces, but still showed evidence of the fierce fighting that had taken place there. Hayes was professional but visibly angry, and he made it clear that he was no longer interested in preserving our community or integrating our people into his organization. Hayes presented his final ultimatum. We could surrender immediately and accept reassignment to his labor camps, or he would eliminate our community entirely and salvage whatever equipment he could from the ruins of the brewery. He had obviously decided that our resistance was too costly to continue tolerating, and that our example might encourage other communities to resist his expansion. I told Hayes that our community had already made its choice, and that we would continue fighting regardless of the consequences. I also informed him that our essential equipment was rigged for destruction, and that any attempt to take it by force would leave him with nothing but scrap metal and contaminated water systems. The negotiation was interrupted by explosions in the distance, indicating that the Portland Resistance Network had launched their promised attack against Hayes' main base. Hayes immediately contacted his command post and discovered that his primary facilities were under assault by a coordinated force that had penetrated his defenses and was threatening his essential operations. Hayes was forced to choose between continuing his attack against our brewery and defending his main base against the Portland Resistance Network. He ultimately decided to withdraw most of his forces to protect his primary operations, but he left a substantial contingent to maintain pressure against our remaining positions. The partial withdrawal gave us breathing room, but it didn't resolve our fundamental situation. We were still outnumbered and surrounded, our essential supplies were running critically low, and we had suffered casualties that we couldn't afford to lose. Derek was unconscious and might not survive his injuries, and several other community members were wounded badly enough to require constant medical attention. Eleanor was working beyond her limits to treat our wounded with medical supplies that were nearly exhausted. She had been using techniques that she remembered from her nursing training, supplemented by improvised methods that she had developed through necessity during our weeks of isolation. Her success in keeping people alive under impossible conditions had made her indispensable to our community's survival. The fighting resumed that evening, but at a reduced intensity that reflected Hayes' divided attention between our position and his main base. His remaining forces continued to pressure our defensive positions, but they weren't launching the kind of overwhelming assault that might have broken our resistance entirely. During the lull in fighting, I received another radio transmission from Phoenix and the Portland Resistance Network. Their attack against Hayes' base had been partially successful, but they had encountered heavier resistance than expected, and were requesting additional time to complete their mission. They needed us to hold our positions for at least another 12 hours before they could provide direct assistance. I realized that our community was being asked to sacrifice itself for the broader resistance against Hayes' organization. Our continued fighting was keeping his forces divided and preventing him from responding effectively to the attack against his main base. But the cost of that strategic contribution was the probable destruction of everything we had built and the lives of people who had trusted me to protect them. The decision I faced was the most difficult of my life. I could order our community to surrender, which might save some lives, but would certainly end our independence and probably result in our enslavement or elimination. Or I could continue fighting, which might contribute to the broader resistance, but would almost certainly result in the destruction of our community and the deaths of people I cared about. I called a meeting of our remaining leadership to discuss the situation and our options. Frank was wounded, but still functional. Eleanor was exhausted, but determined to continue. And Derek was unconscious, but had left clear instructions about his preferences if he couldn't participate in decisions. The consensus was that we had come too far to surrender now, and that our sacrifice might be necessary to prevent Hayes from dominating the entire region. I spent the night making final preparations for what I expected to be our last stand. I completed the documentation of our survival techniques and community organization methods, creating multiple copies that I hid throughout the brewery in hopes that someone might eventually find them and benefit from our experience. I also wrote personal messages to Maria, even though I had no way to deliver them and no certainty that she was still alive. I told her about the community we had built, the people we had helped, and the choices we had made to preserve our dignity and independence, even when survival would have been easier through submission. The final assault began just before dawn. On day 51, with Hayes' remaining forces launching a coordinated attack designed to eliminate our resistance once and for all. They moved with desperate intensity, knowing that their primary base was under threat and that they needed to resolve the situation at our brewery quickly so they could redeploy their personnel. Our defense was fierce but ultimately futile. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition and medical supplies. One by one, our defensive positions were overrun, and our people were either killed or forced to retreat to ever smaller areas within the brewery. Frank was killed while defending the approach to our water purification systems, dying in a heroic last stand that bought us precious time to complete the destruction of our essential equipment. Eleanor was wounded while treating casualties under fire, but she continued working until she collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. By noon, Hayes' forces had gained control of the entire brewery, except for the small area where I was making my final stand. I was alone with the dead man switch that would destroy our water purification systems, our generators, and our food storage areas. Hayes himself approached under a white flag to make one last attempt at negotiation. Hayes offered to spare my life and provide medical treatment for our wounded if I would surrender the facility intact and share the technical knowledge needed to operate our systems. He argued that destroying our capabilities would be a meaningless gesture that would accomplish nothing except the waste of valuable resources that could help other survivors. I told Hayes that some things were more important than survival, and that the knowledge and equipment he wanted would be used to enslave other communities if I allowed him to capture them. I also told him that our resistance had already accomplished its real purpose by inspiring other groups to fight against his expansion and by proving that his organization could be defeated by people who were willing to pay the price for their independence. As Hayes' forces prepared for their final assault, I activated the charges that would destroy our essential equipment and deny him the resources he had fought so hard to capture. The explosions marked the end of our community as a physical entity, but they also marked the beginning of something larger and more important. The Portland Resistance Network succeeded in destroying Hayes' main base later that day, crippling his organization and ending his ability to dominate survivor communities throughout the region. Our sacrifice had contributed to that victory by keeping his forces divided during the critical hours when the resistance needed time to complete their mission. I survived the destruction of the brewery, though barely, and I was eventually rescued by members of the Portland Resistance Network who had fought their way through Hayes' remaining forces. Eleanor also survived, though her injuries required months of recovery, and a few other members of our community managed to escape during the chaos of the final battle. Derek died from his wounds 3 days later, but not before learning that our resistance had helped defeat Hayes' organization and preserve the independence of dozens of survivor communities throughout the region. His last words were about the importance of fighting for principles, even when the odds seemed impossible, and his courage during our final days had inspired everyone who knew him. The physical brewery was gone, but the knowledge we had gained and the example we had set continued to influence survivor communities long after our defeat. The techniques we had developed for water purification, food preservation, and community organization were shared through the Portland Resistance Network, and our story became part of the oral tradition that was emerging among survivors of the volcanic winter. I began writing a comprehensive guide to community survival based on our experience, documenting everything we had learned about technical systems, defensive tactics, and crisis leadership. The manual was copied and distributed throughout the Resistance Network, helping other communities prepare for the challenges they would face as the volcanic winter continued. The world that emerged from the battle for the brewery was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the eruption. Hayes' defeat had prevented the establishment of a totalitarian regime that might have dominated the Pacific Northwest, but it had also left a power vacuum that was filled by smaller, more democratic organizations like the Portland Resistance Network. The volcanic winter was far from over, and the challenges facing survivor communities were becoming more complex as resources continued to dwindle and the environmental conditions continued to deteriorate. But our resistance had proven that ordinary people could defend their communities against overwhelming odds if they were willing to work together and sacrifice for their principles. As I prepared to leave the ruins of the brewery for the last time, I realized that our 90-day journey from the eruption to the final battle had been about more than just survival. It had been about discovering what kind of people we wanted to be and what kind of world we wanted to create from the ashes of the old civilization. The ruins of the brewery still smoldered when Phoenix and her team from the Portland Resistance Network pulled me from the wreckage on day 52. I was barely conscious, suffering from smoke inhalation and burns, but I was alive. Eleanor was found 3 hours later, trapped under debris but breathing. Out of the 43 people who had called the brewery home, only 7 of us survived the final battle. The rest had given their lives to prevent Hayes from gaining control of resources that would have enslaved dozens of other communities. Phoenix was a former engineer who had been working on renewable energy systems when the eruption happened. She had organized the Resistance Network from survivor communities that shared our commitment to independence and mutual aid rather than authoritarian control. When she told me that our sacrifice had been the key to defeating Hayes' entire operation, I felt a mixture of pride and devastating loss that I still carry with me today. The Portland Resistance Network had established a temporary medical facility in an abandoned warehouse, where Eleanor and I spent the next 2 weeks recovering from our injuries. During that time, I learned about the broader situation that had developed during our siege. Hayes' organization had been just one of several military groups that were attempting to establish territorial control over survivor communities, and our resistance had inspired similar uprisings throughout the Pacific Northwest. Eleanor's medical expertise made her invaluable to the Resistance Network, which was struggling to provide healthcare services to scattered communities with limited supplies and no access to hospital facilities. She began teaching her improvised treatment methods to other medical personnel, sharing the knowledge she had gained through necessity during our weeks of isolation at the brewery. I found myself in a different role within the resistance network. My experience with community organization, resource management, and defensive tactics had given me knowledge that was desperately needed by groups that were trying to survive while maintaining their independence. Phoenix asked me to help develop training programs that could prepare other communities for the challenges they would face as the volcanic winter continued. The scope of the disaster was becoming clearer as we established communication with survivor groups across the country. The ash cloud from Yellowstone had affected weather patterns throughout the northern hemisphere, causing crop failures, infrastructure collapse, and social upheaval on a scale that made our local struggles seem small. By comparison, millions of people had died, and the survivors were facing a future that bore little resemblance to the world they had known before the eruption. The scientific reports that reached us through ham radio networks were sobering. The volcanic winter was expected to last at least 3 years, possibly longer. The ash in the atmosphere was blocking sunlight so effectively that normal agriculture would be impossible throughout most of the growing regions that had fed the world before the eruption. The civilization that had existed before September 15th was gone forever, and the survivors would need to build something entirely new from whatever remained. During my 3rd week with the Resistance Network, I began working on a comprehensive manual that would document everything we had learned about community survival during the volcanic winter. The manual included technical information about water, purification, food preservation, and energy generation, but it also covered the social and organizational challenges that communities faced when trying to maintain cooperation under extreme stress. The manual was designed to be copied and distributed throughout the Resistance Network, providing guidance for communities that were facing situations similar to what we had experienced at the brewery. I included detailed descriptions of our defensive tactics, our resource management systems, and our decision-making processes, along with honest assessments of what had worked and what had failed during our 90-day struggle. Eleanor contributed medical sections to the manual, documenting the improvised treatments and pharmaceutical substitutes that she had developed when conventional medicine was no longer available. Her knowledge had saved lives during our siege, and it could save many more lives if it was shared with medical personnel and other survivor communities. The psychological aspects of long-term survival were proving to be as challenging as the technical and logistical problems. People who had lived their entire lives in a complex industrial society were struggling to adapt to conditions that resembled medieval subsistence farming, but without the cultural knowledge and social structures that had made such societies sustainable in the past. I started including sections in the manual that addressed the mental health challenges of post-apocalyptic survival, the techniques we had used at the brewery to maintain morale and resolve conflicts were proving to be valuable for other communities that were dealing with similar stress and uncertainty. The knowledge wasn't just about keeping people alive. It was about keeping them human. 1 month after the destruction of the brewery, I received a radio message that changed my understanding of our situation entirely. A ham radio operator in San Diego had been broadcasting lists of survivor names, and Maria's name was on the list. She was alive, working at a field hospital that had been established in one of the inland camps, where people had evacuated when the volcanic winter reached Southern California. The message included contact information for the field hospital, and I was able to establish radio communication with Maria for the first time since the eruption. Our conversation was brief and emotional, but it confirmed that she had survived the initial disaster and was using her medical training to help other survivors. She had been trying to reach me for weeks, but the communication networks were so disrupted, she hadn't been able to get messages through to the Pacific Northwest. Maria's survival gave me hope that was tempered by the reality of our separation. The distance between Portland and San Diego was manageable under normal conditions, but the collapse of transportation infrastructure and the danger from hostile groups made travel extremely risky. We were both committed to helping survivor communities in our respective regions, which meant that any reunion would have to wait until the situation stabilized. The conversation with Maria also provided me with valuable information about conditions in other parts of the country. The volcanic winter had affected different regions in different ways, but the overall pattern was consistent. Urban areas had suffered massive population losses, rural communities were struggling to maintain subsistence agriculture, and organized groups were competing for control of whatever resources remained functional. I began incorporating information from other regions into the survival manual, creating a more comprehensive guide that could be useful for communities facing a variety of different challenges. The basic principles of water purification, food preservation, and community organization were applicable everywhere, but the specific techniques needed to be adapted to local conditions and available resources. The resistance network was evolving from a loose alliance of independent communities into a more structured organization that could coordinate resource sharing, information exchange, and mutual defense. Phoenix had been elected as the overall coordinator, but the network maintained its commitment to democratic decision-making and community autonomy. My role within the network was expanding beyond training and manual development. I was increasingly involved in planning long-term strategies for rebuilding sustainable communities that could thrive during the extended volcanic winter. The knowledge I had gained from my grandfather's stories about surviving difficult times was proving to be as valuable as my technical expertise with brewing and water purification. The brewing knowledge that had been central to our survival at the brewery was becoming the foundation for a new approach to food production and preservation. In post-eruption communities, fermentation techniques could preserve food without refrigeration, create alcoholic beverages that provided calories and had antiseptic properties, and even produce certain vitamins that were difficult to obtain from the limited food sources available during the volcanic winter. I started teaching brewing and fermentation workshops throughout the resistance network, sharing techniques that communities could use to maximize the nutritional value of their limited food supplies. The workshops were popular because they provided practical skills that could immediately improve survival conditions, but they also served a psychological function by giving people a sense of control over their circumstances. Eleanor had become the network's chief medical officer, coordinating healthcare services across dozens of scattered communities. She was training people with no formal medical background to provide basic healthcare, using improvised equipment and pharmaceutical substitutes derived from available plants and chemicals. Her work was saving lives and preventing the disease outbreaks that could have devastated survivor communities. The intelligence network that the resistance had developed was providing increasingly detailed information about the broader situation. Across the country, government agencies had essentially ceased to function in most areas. The military was fragmenting into competing factions, and large sections of the population were either dead or living in conditions that barely qualified as survival. The reports we were receiving suggested that the Pacific Northwest was actually in better condition than many other regions. The resistance network had prevented the establishment of authoritarian control. Communities were cooperating effectively to share resources and information, and the technical knowledge we had developed was enabling sustainable survival even under the harsh conditions of the volcanic winter. 2 months after the destruction of the brewery, I was asked to participate in a regional conference that would bring together representatives from survivor communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The conference was intended to establish formal agreements for resource sharing, mutual defense, and coordinated planning for long-term reconstruction. The conference took place in a former high school that had been converted into a community center for one of the larger survivor settlements. Representatives from 47 different communities attended, ranging from small family groups to organized settlements with several hundred people. The diversity of the communities was remarkable, but they all shared the commitment to independence and cooperation that had defined the resistance network. I presented the survival manual that Eleanor and I had developed, along with training materials that could help communities implement the techniques we had learned through trial and error during our time at the brewery. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many representatives requesting copies to take back to their communities. The conference also provided an opportunity to assess the long-term prospects for rebuilding civilization in the post-eruption world. The consensus was that the old centralized systems of government and economic organization were not coming back, but that decentralized networks of cooperating communities could create something that might be more sustainable and more humane than what had existed before the volcanic winter. Eleanor presented her medical training programs, which had already been implemented in over 20 communities throughout the network. The death rates from preventable diseases had dropped significantly wherever her techniques were being used, and several communities reported that they were achieving population stability despite the harsh conditions. The psychological health programs that we had developed were also showing positive results. Communities that had implemented our conflict resolution and morale maintenance techniques were reporting lower rates of depression, anxiety, and interpersonal violence. The social structures we had created were proving to be as important for survival as the technical systems. During the conference, I received another radio message from Maria. She had been selected to lead a medical mission that would travel through the southwestern states, providing training supplies to isolated survivor communities. Her work was similar to what Eleanor was doing in the Pacific Northwest, but she was operating in regions where the resistance networks were less developed and the security situation was more dangerous. The message from Maria included information about her plans to eventually travel north toward the Pacific Northwest, possibly within the next 6 months if the security situation improved and transportation routes could be established. The possibility of seeing her again provided personal motivation for the work I was doing to strengthen the resistance network and improve conditions for survivor communities. 3 months after the destruction of the brewery, the resistance network had grown to include over 200 communities with a combined population of approximately 50,000 people. The network was providing coordination for resource sharing, information exchange, and mutual defense that was enabling communities to not just survive but actually improve their conditions despite the ongoing volcanic winter. The survival manual had been copied and distributed throughout the network, and it was being translated into Spanish and other languages for communities with diverse populations. Feedback from the communities was being incorporated into updated versions of the manual, creating a continuously improving resource that reflected the collective knowledge of the entire network. I was appointed as the network's Director of Community Development, responsible for helping new communities join the network and providing ongoing support for communities that were struggling with specific challenges. The position required extensive travel throughout the Pacific Northwest, which was dangerous but also provided opportunities to see how different communities were adapting to the post-eruption world. The diversity of approaches to survival was remarkable. Some communities had focused on agriculture, developing greenhouse systems that could produce food despite the lack of natural sunlight. Others had specialized in manufacturing, creating tools and equipment that were essential for other communities. Still others had become centers for education and knowledge preservation, maintaining libraries and schools that would be essential for rebuilding civilization. My grandfather's stories about community survival were proving to be prophetic in ways I had never expected. The social structures and technical knowledge that had enabled people to survive difficult times in the past were being rediscovered and adapted to the unique challenges of the volcanic winter. The wisdom of previous generations was becoming the foundation for building a new civilization from the ruins of the old. Eleanor and I had developed a romantic relationship during our work with the Resistance Network, built on the shared experience of surviving the siege at the brewery and the mutual respect that had grown from working together under extreme stress. She had become my closest advisor and collaborator, and our partnership was contributing to the effectiveness of both the medical and community development programs. The radio communications with Maria had become more frequent and more detailed. As the infrastructure for long-distance communication improved, she was making progress toward the Pacific Northwest, but her medical mission was taking longer than expected because of the enormous need for healthcare services in the region she was traveling through. 4 months after the destruction of the brewery, I received a report that would have been unthinkable during our early struggles for survival. The Resistance Network was actually growing in population as people from failed communities and collapsed government camps sought refuge in areas where the cooperative model was working effectively. The network was not just preserving the pre-eruption population, but actually attracting new members. The success of the Resistance Network was being noticed by other regions, and we were receiving requests for technical assistance and training from survivor groups as far away as the East Coast and Canada. The survival manual was being distributed through ham radio networks and copied by hand in areas where printing facilities were not available. I began working on advanced training programs that could help experienced communities develop specialized capabilities in areas like renewable energy generation, advanced agriculture, and small-scale manufacturing. The network was moving beyond basic survival toward the reconstruction of technological civilization, adapted to the conditions of the volcanic winter. The psychological and social challenges remained significant, but the communities that had successfully implemented our organizational techniques were developing cultures that were more resilient and more cooperative than many pre-eruption societies had been. The shared experience of surviving extreme hardship had created social bonds that were stronger than the individualistic relationships that had characterized much of pre-eruption society. 5 months after the destruction of the brewery, Eleanor and I were married in a ceremony that brought together representatives from throughout the Resistance Network. The wedding was both a personal celebration and a symbol of the new social structures that were emerging from the post-eruption world. The community bonds that had enabled survival were evolving into the foundation for rebuilding human civilization. The ceremony took place in the same high school where the regional conference had been held, but the building had been expanded and improved to serve as a permanent center for network coordination. The facility included workshops for technical training, meeting spaces for democratic decision-making, and living quarters for people who were traveling between communities. Maria was able to attend the wedding through radio communication, participating in the ceremony from her current location in Arizona, where she was establishing a medical training center for communities throughout the southwestern states. Her presence, even at a distance, provided a connection to the life I had known before the eruption and hope for eventual reunion. The wedding reception featured food and beverages that had been produced using the techniques documented in the survival manual. The fermented beverages I had learned to create were providing not just alcohol, but essential calories and nutrients that were difficult to obtain from other sources during the volcanic winter. During the reception, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from the first day of the eruption to this moment of celebration and hope. The 90 days from the destruction of Yellowstone to the final battle at the brewery had been the most challenging and transformative period of my life, but they had also been the foundation for everything that had followed. The community we had built at the brewery was gone, but the knowledge we had gained and the example we had set had inspired the creation of something much larger and more significant. The resistance network that had grown from our sacrifice was proving that human beings could respond to unprecedented challenges by becoming more cooperative, more innovative, and more resilient than anyone had imagined possible. The volcanic Winter was far from over, and the challenges facing the survivor communities would continue for years to come. But the network had demonstrated that decentralized cooperation could be more effective than centralized authority for managing complex survival situations, and that ordinary people could create extraordinary solutions when they were motivated by shared values and mutual commitment. As I looked around the reception at the faces of people who had survived the impossible and were building something new from the ashes of the old world, I realized that the apocalypse had not been the end of human civilization. It had been the beginning of something different, something that might ultimately be better than what had existed before the eruption. The knowledge that we had gained during those first 90 days was now part of a growing body of practical wisdom that was enabling communities throughout the network to not just survive but thrive during the volcanic winter. The techniques for water purification, food preservation, community organization, and democratic decision-making had become the foundation for a new form of civilization that was more sustainable and more humane than the old. The story I have told you is not just about survival during the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. It is about the human capacity to adapt, to cooperate, and to create meaning and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The volcanic winter changed everything about the world we lived in, but it also revealed the best of what human beings can become when they face challenges together. The manual that Eleanor and I created has been distributed to hundreds of communities, and the techniques we developed have been adapted and improved by thousands of people who are building new lives in the post-eruption world. The legacy of our 90 days at the brewery continues to influence survivor communities throughout the network. The world that emerged from the volcanic winter is not the world that existed before the eruption, but it is a world where human dignity, cooperation, and innovation have proven to be more powerful than desperation, authoritarianism, and violence. The apocalypse tested everything we thought we knew about civilization, and what survived that test was the best of human nature.